and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Entertainment Network. I am your host, Sarah. I am delighted to be with you on this Tuesday, this first episode of December. I cannot believe it's December already. I'm sure we all say that every December, but here we are. I'm excited to be with you to present to you another author interview. Before we get started, though, I do want to remind you, as I always do, to please like, follow, and subscribe on whatever platform you are either listening to or watching this episode on. That really does help the algorithm. If you would like to help in a different way, you can also go to gsmcpodcast.info. There you can leave a tip or a donation. Again, that really does help not only this podcast, but the entire network. While you're there, if you would like to also leave a question or a comment, you are free to do so. I'm happy to engage with those at the beginning of the episode following receiving those comments. Again, that link is gsmcpodcast.info if you want to leave a tip or a donation, if you want to help out the podcast in a monetary fashion. That will be playing, that's playing in the video next to me. It's also scrolling along the bottom throughout the episode. So, if you had a long weekend for Thanksgiving, how was it? I hope it was good. We had an episode on Friday, so I was hanging out with you a little bit over that long weekend, and then just had a nice weekend with the hubby and the dog, and I needed some time just to kind of relax and not think about some things. Sometimes you need those non-thinking times. This was one of those weekends for me, and I was able to do that, which was great. Did not get the tree up. We had talked about doing that. We have to figure a couple things out in terms of space issues. It's going to be behind me at some point. But first we have to figure out, because my desk is now here. This is where the table used to sit. The table that's behind me used to come over here at Christmas, and the tree would go there. So, still trying to figure out some space issues. Not that you probably necessarily needed to know that, but now you do. Anyway, so did not get the tree up this weekend, but hopefully soon. And then this will actually give me some good incentive to get it down. Actually, you know what? It depends on where my desk goes. The tree might not be behind me. It's going to be over there, but it might not be the backdrop for my videos, now that I think about what I just said. Anyway, you may or may not see a tree behind me at some point. And if you do see a tree behind me, it may be up until February. It won't be, but it will give me incentive. If my desk is here and if the tree is behind me, that will give me incentive. Let's talk about a book instead. My guest today is author Kimberly Brock. We are talking about her book, The Fabled Earth. Let me give you a description of that book. Sometimes the truth is found in a folktale. An evening of revelry and storytelling goes horribly awry when temptations arise and passions flare. Those who survive are haunted by memories and regrets in this Southern Gothic tale told across dual timelines. 1932. Cumberland Island, off the coast of southern Georgia, is a strange place to encounter the opulence of the Gilded Age, but the last vestiges of the famed philanthropic Carnegie family still take up brief seasonal residence in their grand mansions there. This year's party at Plum Orchard is a lively group. Young men from some of America's finest families who come to experience the area's hunting beside a local guide, a beautiful debutante expecting to be engaged by the week's end, and a promising female artist who believes she has meaningful ties to her wealthy hosts. But when temptations arise and passions flare, an evening of revelry and storytelling goes horribly wrong. Lives are both lost and ruined. 1959. Reclusive painter Cleo Woodbine has lived alone for decades on Kingdom Come, a tiny strip of land once occupied by the servants for the great houses on nearby Cumberland. When she is visited by the man who saved her life nearly 30 years earlier, a tempest is unleashed as the stories of the past gather and begin to regain their strength. Frances Flood is a folklorist come to Cumberland Island seeking the source of a legend, and also information about her mother, who was among the guests at a long-ago hunting party. Audrey Howell, briefly a newlywed and now newly widowed, is running a local inn. When she develops an eerie double exposure photograph, some believe she's raised a ghost, someone who hasn't been seen since that fateful night in 1932. Southern mythology and personal reckoning collide in this sweeping story inspired by the little-known history of Cumberland Island when a once-in-a-century storm threatens the natural landscape. Faced with a changing world, two timelines and the perspective of three women intersect where a folktale meets the truth to reveal what Cumberland Island has hidden all along. And that is the description of The Fabled Earth by Kimberly Brock. We talk a little bit about this in the interview, that this is not a beach read. This isn't kind of your quick read, summer beach read, and that's not a bad thing. This is more of a sink into it read. You really, it's got some layers. It's got some depth. It's not a fast read. And again, I don't mean that as a bad thing. This is more as opposed to sitting on the beach reading something for escape. This is more like a sink into a deep tub full of bubbles and just lose yourself in this story. It is dual timeline. You've got a whole group of characters in that first timeline, that 1932 story, and then in 1959 you've got the three women that were described in the description: Audrey, Cleo, and Frances. And they all have different things that they are confronting, that they are facing, that they are trying to figure out so that they can move forward. They all have things that are in their past, whether that is their personal past or family past or a combination thereof, and they are trying to move forward. So there's lots and lots of layers, and the events of 1932 have an impact on all of them in various ways. So the past is really coming into the present, much like that dual exposure photograph that is mentioned. So the past is showing up in the future, in the present, in unexpected ways. So let's let Kimberly talk more about the book. Again, it is called The Fabled Earth. The author I'm speaking with today is Kimberly Brock. Hi, Kimberly, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. I'm excited to talk about your book, The Fabled Earth, which we can see behind you. I love that. It means I can remember the name of the book easily.
I'm helping you out.
That's right. Before we get to the book, though, if you wouldn't mind taking just a few minutes to introduce yourself so my listeners can get to know you.
Hi, I'm Kimberly Brock. I am the author of my most current novel, The Fabled Earth. I have two other novels, The Lost Book of Eleanor Dare and my first novel, which is a small literary fiction called The River Witch. And they are all set on the Georgia coast. I know you can't tell where I'm from listening to this accent, right? So I live in the state of Georgia, and I grew up here. I was a teacher for a little while. I taught kids with special needs, and then I became a mother and accidentally became a writer. So that's where we're at with 3 novels now behind me and getting ready to start working on the 4th.
Great. We are going to come back to several of those points. But before we do that, if you can give an overview of the story in The Fabled Earth.
So The Fabled Earth is a dual timeline. It's a historical, it's set on Cumberland Island, Georgia, which is our southernmost island off of the coast of Georgia. It is now a national park. It's mostly still undeveloped, but in the 1880s, the famous Carnegie family, one of the 2 brothers, bought property there with his wife, and they built a bunch of Gilded Age mansions. So that's the backdrop for the story. The 2 timelines are 1932 and 1959. In 1959, the main storyline takes place, and the largest house that the Carnegies built on the island was burned in an arson. And so the mystery of that kind of is part of the story in 1959. In 1932, a girl comes to Cumberland, and she wants to live as an artist in residence for the Carnegie family. And she tells a story one night around a bonfire with a bunch of wealthy kids. Things go wrong, and 2 boys drown. And then you flash back and forth between her and 3 female characters who their lives are brought together by that mystery in 1932, when one of them comes back to town in 1959 to find out what happened. Yes. The other 2 are, one of them is the daughter of a girl that was there in 1932. And then one of them is a young woman who is an innkeeper in town. and she has some secrets of her own. So there's a little bit of social change going on because it's 1959, but for the most part, it's about folklore and family and women and secrets and Southern mythology.
Yes. Toward the beginning of the book, Cleo quotes her grandfather as saying something like, all stories are ghost stories. Was this part of your inspiration for the book, or did it come about later? Talk about that a little bit.
It is absolutely part of the inspiration for the book. It's where I first started thinking about what I wanted to write about thematically. I was teaching a writer's workshop at the Pat Conroy Literary Center in Beaufort, South Carolina. And I said to everybody, I think all stories are ghost stories. And I thought, oh, I'm so smart. But what does that mean? Do I really think that? And I do. I really think that. So why? What does that really mean? And so I wanted to kind of tease out all of the reasons that I believed that. And I was looking for a setting. I grew up here in North Georgia in the foothills of Appalachia, and I love folklore. I grew up hearing ghost stories. That's, part of my storytelling experience and how I learned to tell stories. But I also love the Georgia coast. And I grew up, my first trip to the beach was there with my dad's best friend, who also gave my mother Southern fiction to read. And those were the first novels I read when I was small.
Keep in mind what Kimberly was just talking about reading Southern fiction. And I do think it's kind of funny, in whatever version of funny you want to say. And she was talking about going to the beach and reading at the beach, since we were talking about this not being a beach read. But anyway, random way my brain was working right there. But keep that in mind about the reading of Southern fiction, because we are going to come back to this conversation and kind of how what we read as children often influences things that we either read or even things that we do later in life. Certainly had some influence on how and what Kimberly writes. So keep that in mind as we go to our first break. You are tuned in to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with author Kimberly Brock. As we get into this second segment, just one more quick reminder that if you want to help out the podcast in a monetary fashion, you can do so by going to gsmcpodcast.info. You see that in the video next to me. It's also scrolling along the bottom throughout the episode. That really does help not only this podcast, but the network as a whole. Again, that is gsmcpodcast.info. Again, thank you as always for every bit of support you give this podcast and the network. It is greatly appreciated, no matter what form it takes. Before the break, Kimberly was talking about some of the influences, the inspiration for this story, and she was building a story. We were in the middle of that, and she was just talking about going to the beach as a child and reading Southern fiction, that some of her mother's Southern fiction. Wanted you to keep that in mind over the break, just reminding you of that now, returning now to the conversation with Kimberly.
So the idea of where stories come from in my state, and the idea of ghost stories. I was thinking about those things, and this is going to sound like I'm going around in a circle, but that's how we tell our stories here.
You're good. I think I know where you're going. So
I got married in the backyard of this house I grew up in that was 100 years old under a big 100-year-old oak tree. And there were only about 25 people there. It was a very intimate, sweet little wedding. And then 3 months later, this was in 1996, we heard on the news, like everybody else at the same time, that JFK Jr. and Carolyn Bessette had been married in this secret wedding on Cumberland Island, Georgia. And I thought, oh, we're just like the Kennedys. Isn't that wonderful? And, we laughed about that. So when our 25th wedding anniversary came about a few years ago, we were looking for somewhere special to go. And my husband got us a reservation at the Grayfield Inn on Cumberland Island. It's one of the houses that the Carnegie family built there. And now it's an inn. It's the only place you can stay on the island unless you camp. And so I got lucky. I got to go stay at the inn. We dropped a mortgage payment and went. And so when you pull up along the side of the island, because I'd never been there, and I know it has this long, crazy history back, indigenous history, and then revolutionary history, and then the planter history, and everything you would expect in the coastal South happened on this island, plus more. Because then you have all those Gilded Age mansions. It's a strange place. I wanted to see it. We pull up. We have to get there by ferry. We're the only people on the ferry, and there's all the live oaks and moss, and it was spooky and quiet. And it occurred to me in that moment that it would have also been JFK Jr.'s 25th wedding anniversary, if not for that plane crash. And all the hair stood up on my neck and on my arms. And I thought, if I was looking for a place to set a story about ghosts, this is the place. And it's such a haunted place on its own because of that long history and because of the history of the South, which is difficult to write about. It's hard to write a historical fiction about the South without it being a big haunted story. So that's where it sort of began. My thinking was, okay, this is a Southern mythology. You have these Carnegies in the background, like the old gods on the mountain, and they're not really real to the people who are living. And it's a fictionalized town called Reverie that's based on some real coastal towns in Georgia. But they're looking in 1959 at this place that's sort of disappearing. The old gods are getting farther and farther into the past, and the future is right there, and there's the river in between. It just all seemed like, okay, this is the place to tell a folklore and a ghost story, and to talk about why I think all stories are ghost stories.
Yeah. And there's a scene in the book that it's not really pivotal to the story, but it speaks to exactly what you're saying, where one of the female main characters is on a ghost tour, and her tour guide is telling her about this ghost that he wants, that has just a name on her gravestone, nothing else, no year. So she could be a Revolutionary War widow, or she could be Civil War, or maybe she's Native American, and just exactly what you were saying, all of this history. Then, so I don't really have a question in there. It was just struck me as you were talking about.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going for, and the fact that so much of our history as women is lost in that way. It's just a name on a stone, and that's a little reflection, a little Easter egg, I guess, to my last novel that was about Eleanor Dare, who's part of the Lost Colony. And there is a stone that features in that novel that has her initials on it, and it's a mystery. The lost stories, the things that we don't know from our history, and the things that we make up about those people and turn them into heroes, folk heroes, in ways that may or may not be true or appropriate, for what we need and what mythology is. And that, to me, I think is the theme at the heart of this book. And not just as our country, but in our families, and in our own lives and relationships, and what a fiction is, and why we do that. Why are all stories ghost stories?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think especially with women, because they aren't, history is generally told by men and the victors in whatever
Yeah.
conflict is happening. And so
Yeah.
women's stories don't get told. So they are more ghost stories,
Yeah.
Than anything else.
But
So
I think too, stories are, to me, I think one of the things I realized as I was writing this novel is that stories are a very spiritual thing. They are the most spiritual thing about us as human beings, I think. Um, and I wanted to think about that, and I wanted to reflect it in this. I think I used the setting and the natural setting. There's a place in the river in a salt creek where the tide will run both ways. And off of Cumberland Island, they call this place the Dividings. And I set the story there, and where my main character, Cleo Woodbine, whom you see in 1932 is this young woman who's sort of an optimist and a dreamer, and she really has a lot of ambition for herself, and then really makes some mistakes that only in your youth, those kinds of like random choices and mistakes that you make set your life on a path. And so by 1959, she's a recluse living in this place, and she's been stuck internally in the same place as well for 3 decades. But the river is running both ways in front of her all the time, between her and the mainland. And I thought, that's what a story is. And we exist as human beings in this fixed point at all times in our life. But if we are willing to tell the story and we're healthy, we can reflect on the past. And at the same time, we can dream about the future. And we're doing all 3 things at the same time. And that's how our stories carry through generations and across seas and across mountains. That's how folklore works. It's how we connect with one another and have hope for what's coming next and learn from one another. And so I think that's what I'm doing for each of my characters. They all have a ghost of some kind in their lives that they're having to contend with. And if they are willing to stand at that fixed point that they're in this story in 1959 and reflect and dream, then they can contend with that ghost and have peace with it. It changes them, and they change one another.
In some ways, I mean, your 3 main characters are almost 50, late 20s, or very early 20s. So different ages, but all kind of having coming of age stories in some ways because of exactly what you're saying. They're trying to figure out the past that they don't quite fully understand. And then how is that past going to affect their future, and what choices are they going to make?
And we're talking about, big literary things here, but it was very much about cycles, because an island, does that. It cycles, it moves, it changes, and yet it's fixed. An island like that will roll over. A barrier island is what they call rolling over, and storms change it and it reshapes, but it exists. And sometimes it will connect to the mainland, which is part of what happens in this story. So I wanted the lives of these 3 women to, when you pull the lens back, to look like that, as what is a woman's life, that you're always the same woman, but you're changing, and it's a cycle over and over again. It's not like the arc starts here and goes to the end. It's lots of little cycles of life. So I was thinking about that.
Yeah. Was it always going to be from multiple points of view, or did you ever think about writing it from maybe just Cleo's point of view?
I always try and have like one main character and, one maybe other secondary character, and keep it small, and it never works out that way. I always have this huge cast, and this book has a huge cast of characters. Like, you need, I think, to take notes, because there are a lot of people, because it's a town, it's a community.
And it's a small town, so they're all related and connected.
Right, everybody knows everybody else in this little cluster of people, and they're all interconnected. That was very intentional. And then you have to flash back in those chapters that are labeled Fable for what happens to Cleo Woodbine in the 30s. And there's a little cluster of people that are there during that time. And there are a million Carnegies. So I had to kind of choose so everybody knows Andrew Carnegie.
Mm-hmm.
This is his brother Thomas, who bought property on Cumberland with his wife Lucy. And they had 9 children. So there's a lot of them. And I had to sort of decide, okay, she built houses on that island for all of her kids, and some of them still exist. And I chose which ones I wanted to mention and talk about, and kind of keep them in the periphery too. I didn't want them to be too well known to these average people that are living there. I wanted there to be that little bit of separation, and that, they should be a little wonderstruck by these strange people that live out here with all of this money. And then the stories of them, because they're no longer there. There's only a few of them. And so it was fun to kind of have them sprinkled into the backdrop, but not accessible necessarily to just the average folk. But it meant, like you said, that there were a lot of people. And I don't set out to write dual timelines either, and I always do. And I think after talking about this book since October, that it comes down to how I learned to tell a story. I think it's a cultural thing. We talk about our families. You don't come to the South without people asking you, well, who was your dad? Who were your grandparents? Where did they live? People. We started our conversation here with me asking you, well, where did you live? And how did you get where you're at now? And I don't know exactly why that is, except it, I think, begins with colonization. And then, where do your people move to? And how are you connected? And trying to fit, and it's still just in the conversations that we have. Yeah. Where have you moved from? Where did you start? And so when I start to tell a story, when I start to write a story, I'll get just a little ways in, and then I'll be like, but you remember when. I have to remember when, always when I'm telling a story. There's something back here that happened that influenced what I'm talking about now. And I don't know if it's just habitual or if it's just how I learned to do it.
Before we went to the first break, I was talking about what we read in childhood and how it affects sometimes what we do as adults, or sometimes maybe just what we read as adults. But that kind of segues to what I'm saying here, in that our past always affects our present and our future in some ways. And if it does us, then why wouldn't it affect that of the characters? So what Kimberly is saying makes total sense, that wanting to go back and have that previous timeline in a lot of cases to help explain the backstory of the characters that she is writing. We are going to take that second break. When we come back, Kimberly's going to be talking about how she keeps track of not only multiple timelines, but multiple points of view. You are tuned in to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows. Available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with author Kimberly Brock. Before the break, Kimberly was talking about writing dual timelines and sometimes not wanting to write dual timelines, but feeling the need to go back and fill in some of those backstories. Let's go ahead and return to the conversation with Kimberly. So what are the challenges then in a very large cast of main and secondary characters and dual timelines? How do you personally keep track of everything?
It's awful. It's awful. I wish I didn't do it. And I will tell you this, it's not awful for me. I know it all. It's easy for me. It's hard to get it on paper in a way that translates to make sure that everything that I know is connecting. And so I rely on other readers, early readers, and I rely very heavily on my, thank God, brilliant literary agent and her foreign rights agent, who both read for me, and my editors who know this is how I write. And so if there's a missing piece, because I won't know it's missing, because I know it all.
Right.
And she'll often say to me, I know you know all of this, even pieces of story. Why have you not written it? And I'll realize, oh, I know this. You don't know this yet. So it takes a village to get everything out of my head onto the page. I wish I wrote a simple story. I dream about writing a simple story. I think this will be the time. This will be the one. It's just so simple when I come up with the idea, and then it's not when I write it.
Well, it's a goal, right? I guess.
Yeah,
right. So then I would assume the research would be another huge chunk of your time as a writer. And then how do you decide what to research and how much to include?
Right. I think what it comes down to is that theme or that question that I'm working with. And I don't always know it's a question necessarily until I'm at the end of the book. Sometimes I'll realize, but I am, whether it's subconsciously or very consciously, I'm choosing, like, I'll stack up books and photos and videos and interviews and everything I can come up with, art, recipes, music, so much music from time periods that I'm working in, letters. I'll watch, like for this movie or for this book, sometimes I watched really old movies from the 30s so that I could just kind of see how people were interacting, or, you know, all of these things that I sort of pile up around myself. And that's not even the factual stuff about the island, the factual stuff about the Carnegies, all of that too is part of it. And then I have to tease out what serves the story. So I have the person. What is she seeing in her house? Like I have Audrey Howell, who is the 19, 20-year-old innkeeper. What's that inn look like? What's there? What is part of this record collection that she has in 1959? What music is out during that time? Not just in the year, but in the months that we're talking about. What has released? What's showing at the historic movie theater? What does that look like? Who's allowed in the theater? Who's not allowed in the theater? All of those facts are chosen because they're serving her story. And because I want the reader to drop right down into the moment that she's living in and for it to feel real to them. And I have to leave some things out. You can't put everything in there that I love. Like there's all these little stories and fantastic stuff about the Carnegie family because this wealthy people living on an island with no rules. It's a lot of fun. So I had to pick and choose and to be respectful about what I include, about people whose families existed or who may still be living, because they are, and yet be truthful. So it's a little game that you play the whole time. You know, are all stories ghost stories? Well, what is going to serve to answer that question in this scene? What movie can I choose from that time to be playing on that screen in that theater that serves that question and yet is real to my reader if they look it up? And then what doesn't matter, you know? It is fiction, so some of it I can fudge a little bit, but it's a kind of a puzzle that you put together as you go along. And then, you know, you mourn the things that you can't put in the book that you really wish you could include, because there were things that you fall in love with, and you have to just let that be okay, that's part of your collection, and everybody else, if they want it, they have to go find it themselves.
Yeah. Other ghosts in the book would be some of the houses on Cumberland in 1959 because they've just been left, and so you can. But so the characters are constantly going into these houses in various states of disarray. That for me is always kind of fascinating, of places that are just left, and in various states of still with some furnishings, but just the fact
Yeah.
that, the characters are going in these places, I think is fascinating.
I was such a snoop when I was little, and I still love, to poke around places. And we had a big old library that I grew up loving to go to. We didn't have air conditioning while I was growing up, and the library had air conditioning. So we spent a lot of time at the library, and it was a big old house, but we couldn't go upstairs. And I just knew there was stuff up there I needed to see and get into. It just drove me crazy. And so I've always loved that and the idea of that gothic, Southern Gothic idea of a big crumbling mansion, that's appealing to me. So the fact that these places exist, Dungeness Mansion, the largest of the homes, still was standing in 1959 at the beginning of the novel, but it had been abandoned in the 20s. And most of what had been inside the house, art, furniture, had all been removed to other homes that were still being used on the island at that time. But Plum Orchard is another one of the huge homes. It's this big, monstrous elephant of a house. It's a big white thing. They all look like they just dropped from the sky, and like they have no idea how they got there. What are we doing here? We don't belong here. It's very interesting. And it still had some furnishings, and the family would still come and go from there some, even in 1959. You can tour Plum Orchard. The National Park Service runs a tour. And like the pool house that was at Dungeness is gone. It has fallen in. They all had these indoor pools that the family, and that pool in this novel is real. In Plum Orchard, they had one, and at Dungeness, that pool house is gone, but it did have the rings that feature in the novel, and they would, the acrobat rings, they would play on those rings across the pool, and they would turn the lights out. They played those games. It was quite a rowdy place, that pool house, from what I understand.
So,
the house, the largest house, when it burned, those ruins are there, and you can tour them, go and see them. They're very spooky. It is incredible to see what was there and to imagine what it was like in its glory days, and the idea of that, of what glory means, and how that term is kind of thrown around in the South, and in this ways that are a bit dangerous, right? Not what you would hope glory would be. And the way I used that a little bit for some very literal poison in the book.
Yeah. I was just going to say, play on words. Don't want to. always tricky talking about things. You don't want to give too much away.
Yep. Yeah.
What draws you to writing historical fiction?
Oh, I think we already talked about that.
Yeah, I think so. But
that it is a ghost. I think I could write historical fiction about lots of different places, and I have ideas for, like, the next book that I'm working on is not on the coast. It's not in the coastal South. It's in the mountain South. So it's up in North Carolina. And then I have an idea that's out in California, actually, on the coast. So, but they do all have a historical element to them. And I think they will always have a Southern character, because whether I want to write with a Southern voice or not, this is it. This is where it's coming from. And so my subconscious is always going to deliver that, no matter what. And to me, I think the South is a big haunted house. That's how I see it. And so it's full of ghosts. Our nation's history is full of ghosts. And so I really can't help but write a historical, because the ghosts are our past. And I can't help reflect on that as I'm writing. Even if I'm writing a really contemporary character in my first novel, she's a contemporary woman with a house full of ghosts.
Because you can't stop thinking about, well, how did you get here? So makes sense.
It's true.
Makes sense. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that fourth novel that you're working on right now? What can you say at this point?
It's set in Asheville, North Carolina, another like soul home of mine. We travel there a lot, and I'm just devastated right now about what's happened. But I have a novel set there. It's another dual timeline. I know I just keep doing it to myself. This is a two spinster sisters who have refused to speak to one another for 30 years, living in their family home together.
Oh, geez.
And yeah, in 1925, and they go to a New Year's party at the Biltmore mansion there. And there is a room in the basement of the Biltmore that only recently they've figured out. It has all these kind of spooky murals. It looks like a children's party, but it's actually from an opera that was a gypsy folk opera. And they had a New Year's Eve party there. So the girls attend a party there one night with a boy that they are both in love with. And the oldest sister is supposed to marry him the next morning, and he leaves her jilted at the altar. And they know what happened to him. And that is why they haven't spoken in 30 years. So then in 1964, when the book opens, the sisters are elderly and leaving their family home for the last time. They've sold it on the courthouse steps. It's been taken. And the owner shows up, the new owner, and guess who it is? Except he does not appear to have aged a day.
Oh.
And they figure out what happened. It's called The Winter Bees. And I think it's going to be fun to write about.
I am intrigued. I want to know who he is decades later and why he looks like the guy from decades earlier. I'm sucked in, and just from that little elevator pitch. So it's a good elevator pitch, for me at least. We're going to go ahead and take our next break of the episode. When we come back, we'll be talking more about some of the, it's not exactly magical realism, and we'll cover that. Not quite, but Kimberly calls it a sense of wonder, and we'll talk about that element of her stories. You are tuned in to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with author Kimberly Brock. Before the break, Kimberly was talking about her current work in progress and the mystery that is involved in that. That description of what happens and the mystery of it leads to her next comments on wonder tales, or a sense of wonderment, as she will put it, which just leads us into the following conversation.
I mean, I like writing something that has a sense of wonder to it. I think I love folk tales, but I think really what I'm writing are wonder tales. It's not necessarily full-blown magic realism, but it's the idea of it just around the edges, that there are things that we don't necessarily know or understand, that there's a question, that there's a mystery to life and to the world, the natural world, and to us. And I like that. I like that I don't have the answers. So I think that's what I write about.
Yeah. And there's that element in this book as well with, again, when, you don't want to give too much away, but there is that natural element and a little bit of
mysteries in the world.
Yeah. It's not quite full blown magical realism, but definitely in the folklore, the what if, the what am I seeing
choose
exactly?
What you believe, I think, is what it comes down to. If you want the monsters to be real, they might be.
Yep.
If you need an explanation, you can have that too. I like giving that to my readers, the choice.
Yep, I like it. Okay, so how did you accidentally become a writer?
So I had children. Like I said, I was teaching kids who had behavior disorders, like extreme behavior disorders and learning disorders. And so there was a lot of storytelling involved in that, a lot of entertainment, and figuring out how to engage somebody. And then I had children, and I did theater when I was in school. And so it's always been storytelling. But when I had my kids, they were little, and we lived in Seattle for 4 years, which felt like moving to the moon. I was alone, sort of out there with my daughter.
Mm-hmm.
And she was 9 months old. We moved to Raleigh, and I didn't know anybody. And I had these 2 babies that were 16 months apart. And so I didn't meet anybody. I didn't go anywhere. I was at home, and the internet was kind of new.
Mm-hmm.
And they would nap, and I would get online. And it was like having the library at home. So I was just entertaining myself. It was me finding a way to tell stories like more again. And I read a book, and the author's email was on the back of her paperback that I picked up at the grocery store. And it was the first email I ever sent. And I thought I would never hear back from her. It was like, sending it into the ether, right?
Yeah.
And she emailed me back, and we started to correspond. And she said, "Have you ever thought about writing to publish?" And I said, "No, I never thought about that. I wrote lots of little stories when I was a kid, and like won Language Arts Fair awards. And I won a little award from the Georgia Poetry Society in 5th grade, but I never thought I would publish anything that was like, hey, Kim, you want to be a movie star?" It didn't seem real.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad always said, have a job with insurance.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I didn't think publishing would do that. So when she said that, I kind of laughed and joked it off. But she was a bestseller from the South, but all of her stories that were set in the South were not getting picked up in New York. So she and a couple of other authors who were Southern writers who were not able to sell their Southern stories in New York had started a small publishing house of their own. And she said, if you will write a short story to go with this anthology, we have this little town and it's populated, and you can, use some of our characters, set it in this town, bring your own original characters to your story. And I said, well, okay, I can do that. So I wrote a short story, and then I asked her what to do. And she said, well, send me a synopsis. So I looked up synopsis because I had no idea. And I wrote a synopsis that was longer than the short story and sent it to her. And she liked it. And she said, so when this is done, send it to me. So I hit send because I had already written the story, and she bought it. And I thought, well, that was easy. I'll write a book. It was not easy.
Into a false sense of security.
Yeah, it was like 6 years, I wrote another little book, and it was 6 years before I published Eleanor Dare, my second novel, after the first one. The first novel won Georgia Author of the Year award. Eleanor Dare did very well. It was on the Southern Independent bestseller list for 3 weeks.
Nice.
And then this one, and it was nominated for some awards and shortlisted. And then this one's done very well, but it was like sort of an accident. I didn't set out to be a published author, and I had to learn along the way as I was writing.
Yeah.
So I'm not a historian, and I'm not really a writer. I'm a storyteller.
Okay.
And so I have figured out how to be a writer, and I have figured out how to be a historian, but I'm really a storyteller.
Okay. So from that experience and from all of those learning curves, what's your main piece of advice that you would give to someone who would also like to write?
Is that there are 2 things going on. If you are a writer, it means you write stories. If you're an author, it means you publish stories. So you do the business part of it. You can quit being an author. You can quit the business. you will never be able to quit being a writer.
Mm.
So don't fool yourself. Because it's how you process the world. And I tell myself, like, when I get frustrated, I think, oh, I quit, I'm done. But what I'm really quitting is the business. I need to quit the business for a little bit so I can remember the joy of the writer part. That's just who I am, and that I enjoy processing my life and the world and my questions through story. If you want to be an author, the only answer is don't quit pursuing it. Just don't quit trying. You have to just continue. Somebody somewhere is going to want to publish you, but don't think that the author part is going to give you the joy, because it won't. It lasts about 2 minutes. When it publishes, you're thrilled to death. It lasts about 2 minutes when you go in and you see it in the Barnes & Noble after years and years of crying when you go to Barnes & Noble. I mean, it makes you feel really good for about 2 minutes.
Yeah.
The joy is in the writer part.
Makes sense. Thank you. When you take time to read just for you, go to authors and genres.
I like wonder tales. So
Sure.
I love, I can remember, like, Joanne Harris was early for me, and I loved Alice Hoffman from young me. I loved all of her books. And then I do remember finding Sarah Perry, who wrote The Essex Serpent a few years ago, and loving her. And there's an Irish author named Jess Kidd who is fantastic. She does ghosts better than anybody I've ever read anywhere, anytime. And I, of course, loved V.E. Schwab's Addie LaRue was wonderful. But I also love all literary things. Like, I loved Circe was wonderful. That character-driven, voice-driven novels I love. But I also love books that are very thick and deep, and I like a literary voice. So I love Barbara Kingsolver. I love Zora Neale Hurston, and I loved Beloved. Toni Morrison's Beloved just turns me inside out. It peels my skin off. I love that book so much. And lately, Bonnie Jo Campbell, I like the grit of her work and the realness of it. So I kind of combine those two. Northwoods by Daniel Mason. He does a beautiful job with a wonder tale that also feels very real somehow. I want my magic to feel like it's coming up from the ground. You know, I want to feel like it's real around me. So those stories. I also remember I loved Diane Serafield's first novel. Once Upon a River was her second one. I loved it. And the 12th tale? Is that what it was called? So I remember that
you would ask me in the moment, can't remember.
Beautiful. And I think, from when I was very young, all the stories that were like that, the fantasy stories where I have it on my desk. Where is it? Here. This little book, I just ordered it from my childhood. I can remember at my grandmother's house reading.
Oh, yeah.
And it's two sisters who go with their father, and they get on a carousel in New York City, and then the horses come off the carousel and they ride through the city on the horses together. It's a simple little story, and they see the city, and night falls, and then they come back to the carousel and just go home. It's not like a life-changing thing necessarily, but the idea that there's magic in the world are always the stories that appealed to me.
Yeah.
With a little mystery to them. Like, I loved Nancy Drew when I was little, because I liked the fact that she just prowled around, and I just loved the fact that she had a car, and she had all this initiative of her own to do these things. And so those are the books that I go to. I want a strong voice. I do tend to really like female writers and female stories, protagonists. But I also love William Kent Kruger. He writes a really beautiful lyrical novel and through a male lens, but they're very sensitive, and I think it's a character. If I can connect to a character, that's a book. I'll follow them.
Yeah. Yeah,
not so
absolutely.
interested in plot. You know, you could take me anywhere on a plot, as long as I really like the character.
Yeah. And the opposite, if you really don't like a character, it's very hard, even if it's a compelling story, to stick with it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I cannot agree with Kimberly more. Characters are super important. I have to like or relate to or have some connection with some character in a book. I mean, if I don't like or find any of the characters compelling, it is so hard to finish a book for me. I need to have some connection. I need to have some reason to root for those characters. And if I don't have that, I very rarely DNF a book, but that's a good reason to right there. At any rate, we are going to take our final break for this episode. When we come back, Kimberly will be giving you her website and social media. You are tuned in to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with author Kimberly Brock. Before the break, Kimberly was talking about some of her go-to authors and genres when she is reading just for her. Let's go ahead now and go to the conclusion of my conversation with Kimberly. If you want to know more about you and the books, where can they find you on the internet and any social media that you're active on?
So my website is KimberlyBrockBooks.com. You can find me there. There's a contact page you can use to email me. And then social media, I'm on Facebook. I really like Instagram. I'm on Twitter, sort of, kind of. I just started Threads, trying that, and Blue Sky, trying that. Yeah. And then you can also find, I do boards on Pinterest for my novels too, if you like pictures and things. There's a book club kit on the website for all the books. I think they're good. They've got photos from Cumberland Island for this one and recipes, and they've got playlists. I love playlists. So I did playlists for a main playlist for this book for the Fabled Earth, and then also for the third character, Audrey Howell's husband, husband who dies. He leaves behind a record collection. So there's a 1950s record collection that she plays at the end, and there's a playlist for that too, which I think is fun.
Fun. That sounds like a rabbit hole that you could very easily go down.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Not come out for a long time.
Yeah, for sure.
Love it.
And book tour. I'm still doing some tour dates. I had a huge tour in October, but there's still a few that are going on, so I may be around. Lots of podcasts like this one. And then the paperback comes out this summer, and I'll have more dates where I travel some.
Perfect. Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you.
Not to Portugal, I don't think, but
maybe Lisbon. You should see if you can slip Lisbon in there.
I know.
I'd drive 3 hours to come meet you in Lisbon.
I was in California. That's as far. I mean, I did. I came all the way out to Santa Monica for this one. That was
actually,
yeah.
That's just as far of a flight because you're on the East Coast.
I know.
Direct flight to Lisbon is like 5-6 hours.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Put it on your next tour.
I might have to do it.
Love it. Kimberly, is there anything we haven't talked about that you want to make sure you highlighted, especially about the Fabled Earth?
I think I have said everything I can think of to say. It is a dense book. That's what I keep being told, dense, and I hope that's a compliment. It's not a fast read. I tell people it's low and slow like barbecue because I'm a Southern writer.
Yeah, I think they do mean dense in a good way. It sounds like a backhanded compliment, but you're right. It's not a beach read that you're going to sit down and read in an afternoon because you really want to sit with it and you want to make sure that you know what's going on and you can't, you don't want to skim.
I think it is a woman's story. I think it is a Southern story. It's bittersweet. You can't write about the South without writing about the difficult parts of our history here and looking at that. But it's also a beautiful place. Yeah. And there is beauty and love and joy that I want to write about as well. So I hope all of that is in the mix. I hope that these are ghosts that haunt you in a good way.
Yeah.
They're definitely the stories that haunt me.
Well, that's why you have to write them.
Yep.
They won't leave you alone. Well, Kimberly, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about writing and especially about the Fabled Earth. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I had a good time.
Thank you once again to Kimberly for joining me to talk about this book. If you are a fan of historical fiction, of dual timelines, of multiple points of view, of really great female characters, and several of them, then this is a book that you should definitely check out. Or maybe you're looking for a book to give as a gift this holiday season. As I said earlier, this is a book that you really just want to sink down into and spend some time with. You want to take some time to get to know these characters, especially the three women. But also that 1932 timeline and some of those characters and the backstory and the folk tales and even some of the stuff that leads up to 1932, because you get some of Chloe's grandparents and their time on Cumberland and their role in, especially Dooley, Cleo, did I say Chloe? Cleo, I apologize. Cleo's grandfather, who shapes a lot of her thinking and her artistic style, and who she's kind of learning to come to terms with as he is partially the man that she thought he was, and he's also human and not quite the man she thought he was, and some of that is folktale. Like some of her grandfather, turns out that he is a bit like the folktales that he told. At any rate, there's some backstory even to the backstory is what I'm saying. So you really want to sink down into all of those layers and get to know the timelines and the characters and this place, because the place itself is another character and another one of those ghosts, as we talked about a little bit in the interview. Just so many things to enjoy and love about this book. So check it out. Check out her other novels as well. And then she's got the new one coming up that, again, I am intrigued by. So looking forward to that. Thank you for joining me for this episode, and I hope that you will join me for the next interview, when I will be having returning guest Mark Leslie on the podcast. We talked about Die Hard last year and whether or not that was a Christmas movie. This one is definitely a Christmas movie, National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, and I'm not going to say the name of the book because this is a non-swearing podcast, and Mark likes to give me books that involve words that I can't say on my own podcast, which is cool. You can see the title of it there. So this is a trivia book about National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. Many people's one of their favorite Christmas movies, and Mark has put together a book similar to what he did with the book about Die Hard. Whether or not you think that's a Christmas movie, you can have that argument for yourselves, but we're going to talk about this for the next interview, so please join me for that. In the meantime, as always, if you are a fan of this podcast, please do like, follow, and subscribe, whatever platform you're either listening to or watching the podcast on. It really does help the algorithm, as does leaving a positive review. Greatly appreciated. All support is greatly appreciated. If you're on social media and want to follow the podcast there, you can do so on Facebook, X, Instagram, TikTok, Blue Sky. Come find me, or well, yeah, come find me. Come find the podcast, but me by extension, and tell me what you're reading. What's your Christmas list? What's your wrap up for 2024? Just tell me all of those good, nosy questions that I love to know the answers to, that then make my TBR list a billion, bajillion, gazillion miles long, which is how I like it. It should always be longer than I can ever possibly read in several lifetimes. So help me out by coming and finding me on social media. I hope you're having a great week. I hope whatever this week throws at you, this first week of December, it gives you plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great. I don't wanna go to